Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Mendocino Fire Safe Radio Show. Wildfire is a natural part of the ecosystem we all live in, so we'd better be ready for it. Preparing yourself has been the subject of prior Mendocino County Fire Safe Radio shows that have focused on what you can do personally and how to get your home prepared. We'll revisit those in later shows. We've also heard from some of the major players helping protect us from catastrophe, from our local volunteer fire departments to the last show, which featured the chief of the Mendocino Cal Fire Unit. Another major player on the scene is PG&E. Because their power lines are nearly ubiquitous, so is their task of managing vegetation around those lines, and both managing to help reduce the risk of fire and simultaneously somehow keep the power on. It's likely that everyone hearing this has seen the fleets of PG&E crews and contractors busy at that work throughout the county. And today we're going to get a little window into PG&E's vegetation management program and what it's done in the past and what's coming up this year. First, a brief disclosure, which is that the Mendocino County Fire Safe Council has been a recipient of several PG&E grants throughout the years that's helped our work, including one in 2019 that helped fund the chipper that we currently operate, two significant programs in 2020 that I administered that hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about a little later in the show. And with that said, I'm going to welcome our guests. We have with us today Eric Haggerty. He's the Supervising Vegetation Program Manager for Humboldt and Mendocino counties, and Deanna Contreras, who is a spokeswoman for PG&E. And with that, maybe we'll start with Eric. Eric, would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself and your work history and why you do what you do?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Scott. I appreciate the opportunity to come on and talk a little bit about the VM program here that we have within Mendocino County specifically today. So a little background about myself. My training and education is in forestry and natural resource management. I went to Cal Poly, San Luis Obispo, go Mustangs. And I've spent some time working in commercial tree care, predominantly in the Bay Area. I've done inspection and program management consulting for PG&E and worked as a vegetation program manager and most currently a supervisor for the vegetation management program in Mendocino and Humboldt counties, which oversees almost all of our streams of work for at least distribution voltage level vegetation management activities. There's a question here, what motivates me to do what I do? I came on and I felt that I could help make a difference, and be impactful to the community that we serve and be able to provide safe and reliable energy to our end users, and specifically in my space of keeping the trees away from the lines.
Great. Thank you, Eric. Yana.
Hi, good morning. I'll probably turn my video off in a little bit, but I'm a spokesperson for PG&E. I work in marketing and communications. I talk with the media, do interviews all day, every day. It's a full-time job. I cover 8 counties, including Mendocino and Lake County. And right now, as you know, we're in the middle of a winter storm. So that's why I'm kind of going back and forth and checking my email. So I apologize. But this interview is all about vegetation management and trees. And so Eric Haggerty, a certified arborist who's on with you, is perfect for that. So I'm just kind of, listening in, and we'll have any answers for you if you have any questions about PG&E's Community Wildfire Safety Program or anything else with electric inspections or weather stations or cameras, anything like that. I'm here to answer questions, but I know this is mostly about trees. So Eric is the main man for the hour. Thank you.
Great, thanks. And hopefully we will get to some of those. PG&E has a lot of really interesting and related programs, from like wildfire cameras to sectionalization. Hopefully we'll have time to get around to those at the end, but it's absolutely true that I want to focus on the vegetation management first. So we'll be focusing in with Eric. And Eric, maybe you can just give us a little intro to PG&E's vegetation management. How long has the program been around, and kind of resources are you working with? And I guess you cover, I'm assuming that it's everywhere, but you cover Mendocino and Humboldt specifically. So with a focus on that, what is the program overall as best you can tell us, and what are the pieces of it?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess a bit of the history in terms of the California vegetation management as it relates to utilities really started in the early 1900s. And, in the 1920s and into the 1930s, and coming into law in 1942, was General Order 95, which kind of dictates all of the mechanisms for maintaining, constructing, and managing electric overhead utilities, underground utilities, and communications. And as a part of that, it's a whole list of rules. And the rule that pertains specifically to vegetation management is Rule 35. That particular rule in the initial document was, a lot more vague than we see today. In the early 90s, in 1992, it went through a revision. And that's kind of currently, we've had 3 or 4 revisions through the 90s that kind of give us the General Order 95, Rule 35 that we see today. And that particular rule is what stemmed our vegetation management program. So we've been around for, several decades, keeping trees out of the lines on the PG&E system. And it's been an iterative process since, the revisions of Rule 35. And in 2005, we had PRC 42, or Public Resource Code 4293, that was voted in and implemented. And that relates to our state responsibility areas that has an increased radial distance for keeping vegetation clear. That's the 4 foot. And General Order 95, Rule 35 is 18 inches. So that's kind of the brief history of what set us up to have the vegetation management program on our system, and it applies to all utilities in California. So since the 90s, we've been out in force, trimming trees away from the power lines and trying to continue to provide reliable service to our end users. And we utilize those 2, General Order 95 and Rule 35, and Public Resource Code 4293 for the basis of our program. Specifically within PG&E, we have a pretty complex department. We have several different teams that deal with different aspects of our particular our overhead electric lines. So we have a group that deals with our transmission level voltages, which is 60 kV and above, that generally sends our electricity from the point of generation to a substation and to distribution, to our distribution level facilities. So that distribution level facilities are, 750 volts to 59 kV, and that's the space that I live in. So within our particular distribution space, we have several different programs that help us keep the trees away from the line. So we have our routine maintenance program that deals with specifically GO 95 Rule 35 and Public Resource Code 4293 compliance on minimum distance requirements. We have a SEMA program, which is related to tree mortality and drought response, that specifically is a 6-month offset from our routine operation that looks at dead and dying trees that may have died in the interim time from our routine cycle. Most recently, what we've adopted here over the last couple years, and is quite the talk of the town, is the enhanced vegetation management, which generally goes above and beyond, goes above and beyond our state requirements for vegetation management around our facilities. So that includes, removing our overhanging limbs in that 4 foot to the sky area, looking at targeted tree removal of trees that historically have caused outages and caused us issues within our certain geographic areas that we cover and manage. And we also have a fuel reduction program that, really focuses on strategic fuel reduction, within, communities in our high fire threat districts with limited ingress and egress, and helps to really expand the vegetation away from our lines in those situations. And we do have some other special projects that are in the works and we have implemented here on a pretty regular basis. We've used, or over the last 2 years, we've used the heli saw here in the Willits area, as well as along the coast on some of our transmission lines. And we are in the early stages of adapting our LiDAR to our distribution. We've been using some LiDAR information for the last several years on our transmission level voltage lines as it relates to managing our vegetation, but we are also moving into using that and exploring how that works on our distribution level infrastructure as well. Right now, in terms of resources for Mendocino County specifically, we have around 200 internal PG&E employees as well as contractors that are out on a daily basis inspecting our lines, doing the actual tree trimming, and really helping us keep our facilities safe from vegetation that may be impeding in our minimum required distance for as it relates to GO 95 Rule 35 as well as Public Resource Code 4293. As you mentioned, I do cover Mendocino County, Humboldt County, and a little bit of Western Trinity County, and that's specific to our distribution level voltage facilities, and cover the routine SEMA, EVM, fuels reduction, and special projects aspects of the vegetation management for that particular set of infrastructure.
Great. That's a lot of pieces and a lot to cover. I'm going to sort of step back through that a little bit. And, one of the terms, the last section you mentioned was LiDAR, which I'm not sure people are going to know what that is. Can you delve a little bit into what that's about?
Yeah, so LiDAR is essentially it's a light imaging and data ranging system, and so it's a complex set of cameras that capture hyperspectral data related to vegetation, as well as high definition video. In some situations around our facilities. So what we use that for, it's essentially a remote sensing tool, and it's captured via fixed wing aircraft or helicopter at the current time. And we fly a section, let's say specifically to our transmission lines, we'll fly a section of line, and that particular piece of equipment captures a ton of data. And then that data is then taken back. It's all, for a lack of a better term, that data is crunched. And then what we're provided is a list of trees that may be growing towards our, based on its current status in the field, maybe growing towards our compliance thresholds that we want to take a look at. So it kind of gives us a strategic glimpse into where our vegetation is around our lines in real time or relatively real time that we can kind of use to help target field reviews based on urgency and compliance requirements. So there's a lot of good online resources that you can look at specific to LiDAR. If you type LiDAR into Google, you'll get a ton of information. And it'll give you a general perspective of what that particular tool can do in a lot of different aspects. But for what we're using it, we're looking at growth trends. We're looking at, in some cases, tree health based on the hyperspectral data that's acquired during the flights, because it does have the ability to differentiate from, say, green healthy foliage to dying off foliage. And of course, it creates some nuances with our deciduous trees opposed to our evergreen trees. And some of our evergreen trees that do go through periodic needle casting can kind of show that, hey, this may be dying when the tree is actually in pretty good health. So it's really a tool in our toolbox for looking at vegetation in another way, and helping strategically go out and review locations in the field that may be important to us.
Sounds like a lot of amazing data. It sounds like you're getting kind of a window into where sudden oak death is creeping and all kinds of things.
Hey, this is Cobb at KZYX.
Absolutely.
I'm just wanting everybody to know, if you just tuned in, you're listening to KZYX Radio. This is the Mendocino County Fire Safe Council radio show. Our host is Mendocino County Fire Safe Council Director Scott Craddy. And you've just been hearing from Eric Haggerty, the Vegetation Project Manager for Mendocino, Humboldt County, a little bit of Trinity County. And I have a question, Eric. When you're talking about this LiDAR, what have you been seeing overall changing in the county as far as tree health and that kind of thing with that tool?
So with our LiDAR as it currently stands, specific to Mendocino County, we're still kind of in the stages of infancy of really seeing how that data works for us. But what we have been seeing is, it's been really helpful in looking at our compliance, where our trees are in relation to our line, as well as, we are seeing pretty significant die-off on some of our bishop pines on the coast. So we have seen some of that. Specific to some historical data and some projects I've worked on the transmission side, up in the Sierras, it was really pretty influential, during some of our mass die-off that we saw from the beetle infestations that we've seen in the Sierras. So it did help us a lot in identifying trees that were 100% dead, that, either no needles on a tree or needles that are, brown in color. It gave us a pretty good insight into where those trees are relative to our lines, and the possibility based on the height and location of the tree, if they could impact the facilities, and gave us some really targeted information of how we could get out and get some of those trees that are potential hazards mitigated.
Cool. And I'd like to go back and step through. You laid out a few different programs, and I'd like to sort of go through and focus in on them one at a time. The first one you mentioned is routine maintenance, and that I'm assuming is, sort of getting out and looking at as much of the lines as possible. Is that like a yearly thing? Are you trying to cover 100% of the lines in the county in a year, or what's the scope of that program?
Yeah, routine maintenance covers 100% of our facilities within the county on a yearly basis. That program generally runs, roughly from November to November of each calendar year. And we strategically plan where and when we're going to be, inspecting different portions of line. So on the routine side of the house, we really like to think of it in a cycle-based fashion, where we're maintaining a consistent cycle of our routine inspection that allows us really to target our our tree growth in a given year. So by strategically planning to be in and around the same circuits at the same time every year, it allows us to keep our lines in compliance and really have a cyclical basis of trimming, inspection, and trimming. So we kind of have an idea of when we go out and do our inspection on a routine basis, we're not only looking for trees that are fitting the scope of work for routine this year, which the scope of work for that program is anything that could be encroaching on our minimum distance as is laid out by GO 95, Rule 35, and Public Resource Code 4293. So we're looking at our radial compliance, our 4-foot or in SRA, or our 18 inches in LRA. So SRA is state responsibility area, and LRA is local responsibility area. In addition to looking to our radial clearance requirements, we're looking at dead and dying trees, trees that may have significant defect, rot, poor attachment, or a condition that may have changed from the previous routine cycle, from the previous routine inspection, rather. So as we're doing that, we're also looking for trees that would be required for trimming the following year or the year after. We usually look to, 1 to 2 years out in our routine patrol. That way we're getting a good idea of what needs to be done this year and what needs to be done in the next year or two. And so maintaining that cycle allows us to target the trees that need to be trimmed this year for our routine compliance, and then what will need to be trimmed in the following couple years after that as well.
Okay. So I have a question about your basic compliance, the 4-foot radius. Definitely hear a lot of people, a lot of neighbors, just puzzled by the aesthetic appeal, or in their opinion, lack of appeal of some of the PG&E clearance. How does that work for you? Like, sometimes those trees look like they're topped in a way that doesn't make sense for the tree. I don't know, but do you cut whole trees out, or do you only cut within that radius?
So we do both. So generally speaking, for the trimming and the aesthetics, so as it relates to General Order 95 Rule 35 and Public Resource Code 4293, we have a minimum distance that we're required to maintain, which is that 18 inches or 4 feet, depending on where you are, whether you're in a high fire threat district, state responsibility area, or in a local area, say like the city of Ukiah, is owned by a different utility and operated by a different utility, but also falls in the LRA area. So when we go out and trim, we're not just trimming back to 4 feet. We're also anticipating growth. We try and get 2 to 3 years of clearance. And under those certain statutes, it is at the discretion of the utility on the clearance that we get at the time of trimming. It's also a best practice, as indicated by CAL FIRE, to obtain a minimum of 12 feet at the time of trimming. So 12 feet of clearance is pretty significant, radial clearance, but also has to be put into perspective that different species grow at different rates. And so we try and make sure that we have good, adequate clearance for, pruning response or growth response due to pruning. That will help us maintain that compliance on a yearly basis or for a couple of years. We usually trying to look for a 2 to 3 year window of compliance when we do trimming. So that's kind of the why and how we trim and what kind of distances we're trying to achieve at the time of trimming. All of our trimming standards are part of the ANSI A300 pruning standards for arboriculture. And so we follow those. And so you'll see a through cut, a bench cut, a V-notch, sloped, and occasionally we really try not to top trees, but unfortunately in some situations when you have trees directly under the lines, that's the only option, is to do some height reduction trimming there. Which under that premise would be acceptable under the A300 standards for trimming. So we do, and just to touch on your other point, we do removals of trees, and that's where we try and provide some adequate notification to our customers and say, hey, this tree may have this appearance after trimming. We are interested based on growth factors, the ability to maintain compliance based on species. We're interested in looking at removing that tree. So in some situations where a tree is directly under the line, and as we kind of get our customers on board, we are willing to remove those trees underneath the lines, especially in situations where like the aesthetics could be less than optimal. We do have ability to remove some of those trees.
And sort of getting back to the flow on that. So we were looking at so there's a routine maintenance schedule, and I'm assuming then the actual trimming follows on that with some schedule. Is there a look, and then at some distance behind that you're coming through with the crews normally?
Yeah. Historically, we've inspected maybe 4 to 8 weeks out in front of the tree vendor. So the tree vendor kind of runs from a mid-December to early January to December 31st every year is kind of what their schedule looks like. Our inspection schedule is generally, November through November. So on a regular basis or historical basis, we've had inspection go through first, generally 4 to 8 weeks in front of the tree vendor, and then the tree vendor comes through and then completes the work in around that 4 to 8 week time frame. We have had some new contracts go out. I think most of the folks in Mendocino County are familiar with Family Tree Service. So they have opted, and with our support, we're doing more of a concurrent inspection and trim. So we should be seeing maybe a 2 week turnaround time. We're trying to tighten that time frame up between inspection and trim to around a 2 week time frame. So going forward, we should see some tighter time frames of inspection and then trimming within around 2 weeks. And it may even happen on the same day or within close to the same day of the inspection and the trim happening here on a going forward basis.
Okay. And one of our PG&E participates in technical advisory group that the Fire Safe Council holds periodically. You'd mentioned maybe working to get more of a window of insight into what that schedule is, so people know, what to inspect in their area. Is there any? How would that work? Is there a way to get to being able to have that information available, or is it already available out there?
Yeah. So I do recall that conversation here about a month or two ago, Scott, and I have our enhanced vegetation management schedule. It's just about ready. We just finalized that over the last couple of weeks. Our routine schedule is also finalized, and I'm working to get that schedule kind of dissected into more of a geographic region basis, because we talk on our side of the house, we talk circuits. And so that doesn't really correlate very well to most of our customer base, because they think of, I live in Pine Mountain, or I live over in the McNabb Ranch area. So they're not super familiar with what the actual circuit that their house is on. And so it wouldn't be of much value. So as it stands right now, I've just got to do a little bit more work on our routine-based schedule and breaking that out into a more user-friendly format. And then I'll send that over to you, and you can feel free to disseminate that to your constituent base. And that should give a pretty good idea of when and where and what we're doing in the different communities within Mendocino County.
Cool. And if people know when things are coming up in their area, if they have particular concerns, like something that, Aaron mentioned, a tree that's been topped, that it would be better if it was gone, or trees that they want to try to make sure that PG&E works around. Is there a best vehicle for getting that communication happening?
Yeah, so there's several different avenues that you can go through. One, you can call the 1-800-PG&E 5000 number and kind of navigate the automated system. And when you get to an operator, just request to speak with vegetation management. They'll take your information and it will route to my team. And we'll have somebody that reaches out and inquires about the questions that you have. And those can be general questions. They can be concerns. They can be compliments. They can be complaints. But that's a great avenue for getting information to myself and my team. Another avenue that you can go through, or your constituent base could go through, is sending the Fire Safe Council an email and getting it forwarded over to me personally, and I can direct that as appropriate to our local staff that manages our customer cases and customer contact on our behalf. Cool.
Okay, and we'll get to sort of more about cutting issues, but I want to get back to make sure we go through all the programs, because there was a lot there. You mentioned a tree mortality program, and certainly that's a big issue that we get a number of calls about, with dead and dying trees that people want help with. Can you just tell me a bit more about that program, what you're trying to accomplish, and what sort of resources, and if somebody's got a tree near a line, it sounds like that they think is a problem. It sounds like we just heard how to manage that, but if there's a different way to get that information, relative to the tree mortality program, I'd like to hear about that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So we call it CEMA on our side, or tree mortality and drought response is what that is referring to. We also classify it as a mid-cycle patrol because we're doing a 6-month offset. So that particular program is targeting, not only does it look at any type of trees that could be a compliance issue that may have been, some unexpected growth or some type of condition promoted to it, a tree needing to be trimmed for our radial clearance, but it also specifically looks at trees that have died since our routine patrol. And so when we also, I think I should be clear, is that on our routine aspect of our patrol, we're also looking for dead and dying trees at the time of inspection. But as trees are, and being a dynamic living organism, they decide to check out on their own accord, which may or may not be during the time of a routine inspection. So our SEMA and our mid-cycle inspection is really there to help identify those trees that may have decided to check out after our routine inspection, that may have not been showing clear signs and symptoms that they were dying or in the process of being dead before our next routine cycle. So specifically for that program, we will come out, we remove the tree, we'll chip the brush, and this goes for both programs related to routine and SEMA. We will chip brush that's 4 inches or less, and if there's larger wood than 4 inches, that wood will be cut into manageable lengths. That's usually around 4 feet in length, and it does. We can, in some situations, work without cutting it down to a little bit smaller if needed on a case-by-case basis. For customers that see a tree that may have died since our last patrol, calling that PG&E 1-800-PG&E 5000 number is the best way to get a hold of us, or go through the Fire Safe Council would be really great mechanisms. I think something that I say regularly to customers when I'm out in the field and interfacing with them is that we need to rely on our customers to also be our eyes in the field, because we have a finite set of folks that are working through all of the overhead line within our county, our counties of coverage. And so we can't be in all the places at once. And as a result, utilizing our customer base as a mechanism for helping us identify things that could be a hazard in the field is great. And going through the process of calling into the 1-800-PG&E 5000 number is a great way to help us capture things that, may be in between inspections.
Right. And so in terms of the tree mortality program, if somebody's looking at a tree and trying to make a decision about whether they should call, could you just do the quick recap? I mean, what's the criteria? If it looks like it could fall on the line, if it's physically within 4 feet, I mean, what tells people whether it's something that you're likely to be able to take action on?
So essentially, the catalyst for a tree. So when I think about it, there's cases where trees are dead and dying underneath the lines, and in cases where they're grown and they're near our compliance thresholds, we'll go ahead and take those out. For trees that are outside or offset or adjacent to our lines, the criteria really is: can that tree, based on its current location in the field, can that tree, or if it were to fail, does it have the ability to impact our facilities, to come and hit the lines, hit a pole, or hit a guy wire? So if there's a dead tree that's, let's just say it's a Doug fir that's 140 feet tall and it's 120 feet away from the line, we would assess that tree and look to see, does it lean at the lines? Does it, what are the characteristics of the site? And is there potential for that tree to fall into the lines? If all of the boxes are checked, yes, that tree that is 120 feet away from the line, but 140 feet tall and is dead or dying or has major defect, could hit the lines, then we would abate that tree and move forward with removing it. So that is part of our general order 95 Rule 35, as well as the PRC 4293, is to prune and or remove dead or dying trees that could fall into the facility. So a lot of times, and I know that's a point of contention for people, is they go, "Wow, that tree is so far off the lines. Why are you interested in cutting that dead tree down, or why are you looking at that tree?" It's because our state requirements tell us and guide us that we need to be looking at any tree that could impact the lines, based on their height and their position to the line. So a lot of times we're looking not only at the trees directly adjacent to our lines, but we're looking on a far wider scope to look at, especially in our county where we have a lot of really large trees and we're highly, and it's very dense. We're looking outside of our line, or outside of our regular right of way, if you want to say that, outside of the maybe 15 feet on either side of the line. We're looking at it more expanded to say, is that larger tree that's dead, that's adjacent to our facility, is going to cause us problems?
Great. Okay, thank you. Continuing just to move through the programs, there's one that I think may be of particular interest here too. You mentioned a strategic fuel reduction program that was looking at ingress and egress clearance, which is certainly an issue of concern for a lot of people in the county. How is that program developing and for this year, and what are you, how are you looking at trying to figure out where that work will happen?
Right. So that particular process or project based, the fuel reductions, is still in the planning phase right now. And what we're looking at is we're using some risk modeling to look at our different communities, our ingress, egress, high fire threat district or not, whether it's tier 2 or tier 3, access to first responders, and also, like I mentioned, the ingress and egress for the individuals that live in those areas. So as we go through our risk ranking and we look at all of those factors, then we will have the ability to propose different areas that we feel would be of the greatest risk. So what I'd ask at our technical advisory meeting is that if anyone has any areas that fall, within that tier 2 and tier 3 area, high fire threat district, that has limited ingress and egress, if you guys would be generous enough to give us some ideas of what matters to you guys and what matters to our customers, of where we could most strategically, utilize these programs. So, during those technical advisory meetings or through email, if we send some of these areas of concern over to myself, I can take these back to the team that is running the risk modeling and make sure that everything falls within the confines of what our criteria is for implementing these programs. And then, at some point during the year, we can get out there and we can start getting some work done. These fuel reductions really target a 15-foot on center line. So it's about a 30-foot swath directly adjacent to our lines. And that's a little bit different than, say, the grants that are awarded to some of our fire safe councils, is that the fuel reduction is specifically looking at that 30-foot area adjacent to our facilities, directly underneath or to the side 15 feet on either side, where we clear pretty much all of the vegetation within that 30-foot corridor. And what that allows is, it allows a fuel break, and also allows, if it is along a roadway, it allows a little bit better ingress and egress from those areas.
Okay, so we're looking at sort of populated roads in particular that have power lines following them would be the sort of prime targets, if I'm getting that right?
Yeah, for our internal fuel reduction program, absolutely.
Okay. And let me just mention to folks that we are collecting information about those, and I think it can be as simple as it may turn out to be useful for working with PG&E this year, and it may turn out to be useful for grant applications down the road. But if you have a road that you think fits that criteria and can send a Google map with some pinpoints of start and stop points and a little bit of description about why you think it's a particularly important project, we will gather those and as much as possible pass them on. And it looks like Cobb needs to jump.
We are tuned to KZYX Radio right now, everybody. You're listening to the Mendocino County Fire Safe Council radio show. Our host is Director Scott Craddy of the Mendocino County Fire Safe Council. Our guest has been Eric Haggerty, the project coordinator, the project manager for the vegetation project, vegetation management for PG&E, all our power lines going through the county. And they most recently have been talking about abatement and fuel reduction programs. And I know, Scott, you were just giving some contact information to listeners and how to participate with assisting with identifying hazard areas. Maybe you could repeat that for our listeners.
Sure. Our main email at the moment is just firesafe@pacific.net. So you can email us at firesafe@pacific.net to get general information. And our main office phone line, which we just switched phone providers, so it actually gets reception now, which is a big plus for us, is 707-462-3662. And if you can't remember any of that, you can just go to firesafemendocino.org or just Google Firesafe Mendocino and you'll get to our website, which will also get you contact information to get a hold of us.
Right, and you were just talking too about participants, listeners, members of fire safe councils keeping an eye out on their local PG&E area and getting you some kind of pinpoints. Could you cover that a little more?
Well, we were just talking about an egress clearing program that's a little bit kind of, and Eric, you can correct me on this, but a little bit kind of extra that PG&E is going to plan to get to this year. They have some resources, as I understand it, to do some clearing, more focused around clearing underlines that focus on ingress and egress issues and can help with fire breaks in areas. So if you have a roadway that is paralleling a power line that you think is in desperate need of clearance for safety, you can pinpoint the start and stop locations just on a Google map and send it in to us, and we will feed that in for consideration. And I would also like to say, just Eric, I'll pass it back to you in a sec, but the risk modeling you're doing sounds like really kind of interesting and vital information. We'll hopefully touch base later about how hopefully that information can sort of feed back into the grant applications and work we're doing. So we're helping each other figure out where the biggest risks are and getting to them one way or the other as time goes by.
Yeah, absolutely. It's I don't know how much information specifically on the risk modeling, I'm technically allowed to divulge at this time, but I think I can definitely, elaborate a little bit offline about where and what we're doing and kind of what we see as being the priorities, so that our projects internally, as well as any of our grant opportunities and projects within those grants, are hitting the same areas where we may be in alignment with where our high risk is for our communities here within the county.
I have a question about that, if I may. Just in terms of you being a forester and being inspired around that, it sounds like PG&E, over the years has collected a pretty amazing data set about our forests. Is there anything interesting that you've noticed about forest health broadly in the county, or any patterns that you found compelling?
Well, generally speaking, I think the things I've noticed most is in terms of forest succession. So in all forested ecosystems, they talk about succession, which is just it's at the most basic, it's the level of maturity of a forest. When a forest climaxes in its maturity, history has shown us that there are generally some type of catastrophic stand replacement or partially stand replacing event that does occur. Whether it's catastrophic fire, whether it's beetle infestation, whether it's wind throw, or if it could also just be related to specific species and their inherent lifespan. So it does give us some information about, what are we seeing? And generally what I'm seeing is, and look at all the larger scale fires we had here in the Mendocino National Forest, is we had a forest that had not burned to any degree in a long time. And fire is a very normal thing in a forested ecosystem. And stand replacement events or partially stand replacing events is a common occurrence and is part of nature. So what I have seen is that, we have forests that are very mature, they're very dense, and, something is bound to give. That helps regenerate the forest for the next cycle of forest succession. So that's something I've seen over the last, handful of years, looking at, some of our internal data, but also just looking at what's available to the public, looking at our USDA reports and things along that nature. So the inability to do significant forest management or, whether it's funding or whatever the case may be, really goes to more detrimental stand replacement events, similar to what we've seen. So that's something I've noticed on a personal basis, just out of interest, looking into some of how our forests are maturing, and also to some of the events that we're seeing and how widespread we're seeing it too, and some of the implications of how we manage our forests and how we as people interact with those forests living in those environments.
Just to switch to touching on those environments a bit, people have moved into this rural county because they enjoy the nature and the beauty to a significant extent. And so when there are trees being cut and areas cleared, there are a lot of concerns that arise from that. And certainly we've heard a lot of them at the Fire Safe Council. You mentioned some standards for cutting, and I wondered if you could talk a bit more about that. If people are seeing cutting happening that they're concerned about or they don't think is happening right, where should they look to the standards that are supposed to be being followed so they can assess whether there is a concern or a basis for the concern, at least relative to the standards that should be being followed out there.
Yeah. And so where I would direct people, if they're looking at just general pruning best practices and requirements as it pertains to the whole, arboricultural industry in general, would be the ANSI, ANSI, A300 standards. And that's the American National Standards Institute is the one that puts those on or develops those standards based on a whole lot of industry information, which accounts for, tree health, as it relates to trimming, and gives the general guidelines for what we would be looking at when we go and complete specific trimming on a certain tree or in specific situations.
Okay. I know when we direct the crews that work for the Fire Safe Council or on our grant projects out, we, coach them to preserve oaks to the extent possible when making choices, and other natives, and to choose more invasive things when you're thinning, and things that tend to be more flammable. Do those standards cover that? Is that part of the practice when PG&E's out there and when its crews are making decisions about how to go about thinning?
So I think it's important to look at kind of what we're managing and kind of what we're up against there. So of course we want to put, as being a forester myself, we take an oath and being an arborist to be a steward of the land. So we want to be looking and making sure that we're making the best decisions possible in the different situations that we encounter, whether that's removing a tree because we're removing too much of the foliage, which would be detrimental to the overall health and well-being of those species at the time of trimming. But in terms of really targeting, unfortunately, when it comes to managing some of the vegetation around the lines, we get a big mix of native, non-native, and our regulations that dictate how and when we trim are not specific to the species. So we're required to manage the trees as they are in the field. The species, regardless, we have to manage our, radial clearances and the dendine trees, regardless of species around our lines. But that being said, where we see a huge, say, valley oak that's adjacent to the line and we can manage it through minimal trimming, we're going to take that route where we can manage a healthy, mature oak by doing minimal trimming to make sure that we continue to meet our goals that are set forth to us by the state. In situations where it may apply more to, under our routine management and our CMA aspect, we're not doing really large scale clearing. Under our enhanced vegetation management, we're doing a little bit more intensive clearing. All of those projects are governed through a utility exemption through CAL FIRE. And they're also, we're required to adhere to the California Forest Practice Rules that has a vast amount of requirements for dealing with erosion control, clearing, and fuel management, and so on and so forth. So it just really depends on what the project is. But we tried to be as conscientious about what we're doing as possible and following all of our state required guidances for trimming, but also our environmental requirements as well.
Great, thanks. I'm realizing we're running out of time here, and I'm about halfway through my questions for you, but if we still got Deanna on the line, I would also just like to, PG&E has a wealth of other things out there that they're doing to help reduce wildfire risk. Hey, thanks for hanging with us. One, at least I'd want to touch on briefly, is the wildfirealert.org, the camera network that's going on out there, and that it's kind of a cool resource that people can look at and see what's going on around them. Can you tell us a little bit about where that's at and what?
Yeah, of course. I do want to say real quick, though, that we are in the middle of a major winter storm, and our PG&E's local emergency operations centers in Mendocino and Lake counties have been activated. I'm happy to say there are zero power outages right now, but I do want to make sure that our customers, your listeners, are prepared for potential power outages due to low-level snow that's expected. So just want to say that real quick. But yeah, as part of PG&E's wildfire mitigation plan, we're working to reduce wildfire risks every single day. Nearly 1/3 of the electric lines that serve our area that are in central and northern California that PG&E serves are in high fire threat areas, those tier 2 or tier 3 areas designated by the state, by the California Public Utilities Commission. And so as part of our wildfire mitigation plan, we have the public safety power shutoff, and that is to prevent wildfires. We shut off the power for safety when there are certain factors that, we take a look at. Our meteorologists take a look at, our analysts take a look at. It's a lot of weather data that we're looking at, low humidity levels, high winds, sustained winds, if it's a red flag warning, those types of things. And so we are bolstering our monitoring tools, not only our weather stations. We have PG&E has 1,000 weather stations to help with this hyper local data, but also fire watch cameras. And these are those HD cameras that you were just talking about. It's part of the Alert Wildfire Network. Anybody has access to the cameras. So in Mendocino County, PG&E has 12 cameras. A lot of them were recently installed just in the past couple months. And in Lake County, we have 7 of these HD cameras. You can see them at alertwildfire.org. And just click on North Bay cameras, and then you can see them all there. So yeah, it's a really cool part of our community wildfire safety program.
Is that program, am I understand it? Is that like monitored all the time? Or are you in part relying on the public to be keeping it, seeing what's on those cameras and being part of the process of alerting when they spot some fire?
Well, CAL FIRE and first responders have access to the cameras. So there are cameras, the whole system is used by fire managers, Bureau of Land Management, U.S. Forest Service, CAL FIRE, local fire departments. So our partners at the local fire departments we are monitoring those cameras as well. And there are a lot of other cameras from other agencies as part of this Alert Wildfire network. The ones that, PG&E had installed and paid for have, we'll say PG&E on them. And then in terms of all the weather stations, though, this is one of the ways that we're reducing the impacts of a PSPS. We're making the PSPS events smaller. We're impacting 1/3 fewer customers than we did in previous years. And it's because of this hyper-local data that we're able to get. So the weather stations, like I said, we have more than 1,000 across our entire service territory. 50 of them are in Mendocino County and more than 30 of them are in Lake County. And you can see that data at pge.com/weather.
Yeah, and with that, do either of you have any kind of quick wrap-up points that you'd like to make that we haven't gotten to? I'm only about 1/3 of the way through my questions, but so it goes.
Eric could come on another time. No, I just want to say, with our wildfire mitigation plan, many of the things that Eric talked about with the enhanced vegetation management is definitely part of this plan, meeting and exceeding state vegetation safety standards. And that's what this enhanced vegetation management program is. We're exceeding state vegetation safety standards, whereas the routine work that he talked about is mandated by the state. We have to do that.
And you've been listening to KZYX.